Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we step quietly into a world older than the churches of Europe, older than the written myths of kings and heroes, older even than many of the stones that still stand in the green fields of Ireland. Tonight we explore the forgotten history of the fairies. Not the tiny creatures with butterfly wings you may remember from children's books, but the ancient beings once feared as the hidden gods of the Gaelic world. In this deep sleep history journey, we will travel back thousands of years to the age when the Tuatha Dé Danann ruled the land, when the hills of Ireland were believed to be doors into another realm, and when ordinary people carefully avoided disturbing the quiet mounds scattered across the countryside because they believed something powerful still lived beneath them. These were the Aos Sí, radiant, dangerous, beautiful beings remembered in Irish folklore, Celtic mythology, and the oldest fairy legends of Europe. Along the way, we will walk through Neolithic tombs older than the pyramids, explore the mysterious fairy courts that governed the hidden world, uncover the unsettling history of changelings, and follow the strange fate of a Scottish minister who tried to document the fairy realm as if it were a real civilization living beside our own. And finally, we will arrive at the moment when the old gods slowly faded from memory, transformed by Victorian imagination into the tiny winged figures we recognize today. This is not just a story about folklore, it is a journey through mythology, stories, bedtime history, and the deep human memory that still lingers beneath the landscapes of Ireland and Scotland. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, take a slow breath, and imagine the quiet green hills of Ireland beneath a silver moon. The wind moves softly through the grass. Somewhere in the distance, an ancient mound rises from the earth, older than the villages around it. The people who live nearby still avoid disturbing it even today, because in the oldest stories of Celtic mythology, those hills were never empty. They were doors, and sometimes, if the night is quiet enough, they still are. 5,000 years ago, long before the Celts arrived, long before iron rang against stone or bronze blades glittered in the sun, a people lived on the island we now call Ireland who understood something about the earth that modern minds have mostly forgotten. They did not leave books behind them. They did not carve their stories into clay tablets or parchment. Yet if you walk the green fields of ancient Ireland at dawn, you will find their voices still speaking quietly through stone. Imagine yourself standing before the great mound of Newgrange in the pale winter morning. The air is cold and still, and the grass around the monument glistens with frost. The passage tomb rises from the earth like something both natural and deliberate, its circular walls lined with brilliant white quartz that catches the early light. The structure is already ancient, even to the people who built it. In truth, Newgrange was standing 500 years before the first stone of the Great Pyramid was laid in Egypt. And yet here, in the quiet hills of ancient Ireland, the monument remains perfectly aligned with the turning of the heavens. Once each year, at the winter solstice, a narrow beam of sunlight travels down the long stone corridor and reaches the inner chamber where the bones of the honored dead once rested. For a few minutes only, the darkness of the earth opens itself to the sun. Then the light disappears again for another year. Inside that chamber, carved into the stone with patient and deliberate hands, are spirals that seem almost alive when firelight flickers across them. These spirals appear again and again across the landscape of ancient Ireland, at Noath, at Douth, and at other passage tombs scattered across the hills. They are not decoration, they are a language older than any alphabet. Each spiral turns inward like a journey, descending into the earth where the ancestors dwell. To the Neolithic people who built these monuments, death was not an ending, it was a passage downward into another realm that existed just beneath the surface of the world. We do not know what these people called themselves. Their names have vanished, their language is lost, their faces remain unknown to us except as fragments of bone resting in archaeological museums. But what they believed can still be read in the architecture they left behind. They believed the earth itself was alive with memory. They believed the dead continued to exist within the land, beneath the hills, beneath the fields, beneath the rivers that curved across the island. And when the Celtic peoples arrived in Ireland thousands of years later, they encountered these monuments already standing in the landscape like the ruins of another age. The passage tombs were already old beyond memory. Their builders had disappeared so completely that even their names had dissolved into silence. Yet the Celts did something remarkable when they discovered these ancient structures. They did not destroy them. They did not claim them as their own. Instead, they wove them into their mythology. The great mounds became the entrances to another world. The dead beneath them became divine beings who continued to inhabit the land. The mysterious people who had once built the monuments were remembered as something more than human. They became the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, a race of powerful beings who lived beneath the hills and ruled the hidden realm known as the Otherworld. This is the first layer of the fairy tradition in Irish mythology, not tiny winged creatures fluttering through flowers, but something far older and far stranger. The fair folk of Irish mythology were once the gods of the land itself. Their homes were the hollow hills. Their power came from the deep memory of ancient Ireland, preserved in stone long before written history began. But even this explanation hides something deeper and darker, because the passage tombs were not simply monuments to the dead. They were believed to be places where the boundary between worlds grew thin, places where something beneath the earth could watch the living world above. And perhaps, if the stories are to be believed, places where those ancient powers still wait patiently inside the hills, just beyond the reach of daylight. But beneath even this layer of ancient Ireland lies a belief older still, a belief that shaped the entire structure of Irish mythology long before the first Celtic poet ever spoke the names of the Tuatha Dé Danann. To understand the fairy tradition, we must step into the quiet worldview of the Neolithic people themselves. And it is a world that feels strangely intimate, almost unsettling in its closeness to the land. In that distant time, the boundary between the living and the dead was not imagined as a wall or a final doorway. It was something softer, something more delicate. The ancient people of Ireland believed that the veil between worlds could thin in certain places, and the passage tombs scattered across the hills were among the most powerful of those places. When the living approached these mounds, they were not walking toward graves in the modern sense, they were approaching the homes of the ancestors. To these early inhabitants of ancient Ireland, the dead did not vanish into some distant heaven. They descended into the earth itself and continued to exist there, beneath the soil that fed the crops and beneath the hills that shaped the horizon. The land was not empty ground. It was alive with presence. The ancestors were believed to remain aware of the living world above them. They could influence the harvest. They could protect the herds grazing in the fields. They could whisper through dreams to the people who carried their blood. And because of this continuing presence, the relationship between the living and the dead was not passive. It required care, respect, and obligation. Food might be left quietly near the entrance of a mound. Offerings might be placed during the turning of the seasons, especially in the dark months when winter pressed against the land and the nights grew long. Rituals were performed not out of fear alone, but out of recognition that the dead were still part of the community. This simple idea that the earth of ancient Ireland was filled with powerful ancestors beneath the hills would echo across thousands of years of Irish mythology. Even today, farmers in rural Ireland sometimes refuse to disturb certain circular earthworks known as fairy forts. These rings of grass rising gently from the fields appear harmless enough to an outsider, but to the local people they carry an ancient warning. The mounds belong to those who came before. Disturbing them risks misfortune. Crops might fail, livestock might sicken, strange accidents might follow those who disrespect the land. These beliefs are not merely superstitions born from imagination. They are the distant memory of an older worldview, one that reaches back to the Neolithic foundations of ancient Ireland. Over centuries, as Celtic culture spread across the island, these ancestral spirits gradually transformed in the stories people told around fires during the long winter nights. The powerful dead beneath the hills were no longer remembered only as ancestors. They became something greater and more mysterious. They became the hidden people of Irish mythology, the Aos Sí, beings who lived within the mounds and possessed knowledge older than humanity itself. When Christianity later arrived in Ireland, the monks struggled to explain these deeply rooted beliefs. They could not simply erase the old stories, because the people continued to see the hills and feel the presence of something ancient within them. Instead, the Christian writers attempted to reinterpret the beings of the mounds. They suggested that the fair folk were fallen angels, spirits cast out of heaven but not condemned entirely to hell. It was an explanation that satisfied the logic of theology, but it never fully replaced the older understanding held by the people themselves. For the farmers who walked the fields of ancient Ireland, the truth remained simpler and older. The beings within the hills were not angels, they were not demons. They were the old gods of the land, the forgotten rulers of a world that had once belonged to them. And the old gods, as many traditions quietly warn, do not easily forget the lands they once ruled. Even now, the hills of Ireland seem to hold their silence with a certain patience, as if the earth remembers more than it chooses to reveal. But if the fair folk were once gods, where did those gods come from in the first place? Irish mythology preserves an answer, though it arrives in the form of a story both grand and strange. According to an ancient book compiled by medieval monks, the entire history of Ireland unfolds as a sequence of invasions. Each new people arrives upon the island, struggles for sovereignty, and either disappears or transforms into something else. And among all those waves of arrivals, one stands above the rest, because one invasion was not made by humans at all. But the hills of ancient Ireland hold more than bones and spirals. They also hold stories. And one of those stories survives inside a remarkable medieval manuscript known as the Lebor Gabála Éireann, the Book of the Taking of Ireland. According to this text, the history of Ireland did not unfold slowly and quietly. It arrived in waves. 6 great invasions, one after another, each bringing a new people to the island. Each race rising, ruling for a time, and then disappearing into myth or memory. Yet among all those arrivals, the 4th invasion stands apart from the others, because the 4th invaders were not merely human, they were something closer to gods. The manuscripts say they did not arrive in ships, though Ireland is an island surrounded by restless seas. They did not ride horses across distant plains. They came instead in dark clouds, drifting over the mountains of Connacht. The sky dimmed for 3 days, the texts claim, as though the sun itself had stepped aside to watch what was about to happen. When the clouds finally lifted, a new people stood upon the hills of Ireland. They were described as tall, radiant, and strangely beautiful, their presence filled with knowledge that seemed older than the land itself. These were the Tuatha Dé Danann, a race remembered not simply as rulers, but as bringers of wisdom and magic. The manuscripts say they came from 4 mysterious cities in the far north of the world, places that modern geography cannot locate and perhaps never could. Their names survive only in myth: Phalius, Gorius, Phineus, and Murius. In those distant northern cities, the Tuatha Dé Danann were said to have studied under 4 great sages who taught them arts far beyond the ordinary. They mastered druidry, the subtle language of nature and spirit. They mastered craft and metalwork so refined that their creations seemed almost alive. They mastered warfare not merely with strength, but with strategy and enchantment. And they mastered magic itself, that elusive force that in Celtic mythology often blurs the line between knowledge and power. By the time they arrived in ancient Ireland, they were not merely a tribe seeking land. They were something more profound, something standing between humanity and divinity. Yet Ireland was not empty when they arrived. Another people already ruled the island, a race known as the Fir Bolg. Unlike the radiant newcomers, the Fir Bolg were associated with the earth itself. They were builders, farmers, and laborers, people bound closely to the soil. Their world was practical and grounded, shaped by fields and stone walls rather than by spells and prophecy. When the Tuatha Dé Danann arrived upon the hills of Ireland, they offered the Fir Bolg a choice: share the island peacefully or fight for sovereignty. The decision was not easy, but the Fir Bolg understood something important. You do not share your homeland with gods. And so they chose battle. What followed would become one of the most legendary conflicts in Celtic mythology, a clash remembered for centuries in mythological storytelling. It was not merely a struggle for territory, but a struggle for the right to rule the land itself. The fields and hills of ancient Ireland became a stage upon which magic and strength collided. The first battle of Mag Tuired was about to begin. And before the struggle was over, even the king of the Tuatha Dé Danann would pay a terrible price for victory. So the first battle of Mag Tuired unfolded on a plain that still exists today in the west of Ireland, in what is now County Mayo. If you were to walk those quiet fields now, you would see only grass moving slowly in the wind, perhaps a stone wall here or there, the distant line of low hills beneath a pale Irish sky. Nothing in the landscape would suggest that, according to Irish mythology and the ancient manuscripts that preserve it, this place was once the stage for one of the most extraordinary conflicts in Celtic mythology. Yet the texts remember the battle vividly. It was not merely a clash of armies, it was a collision between 2 visions of the world. On one side stood the Fir Bolg, the people of the earth, hardened by labor and survival. Their strength came from endurance, from the rhythm of farming, and the patient construction of their settlements across ancient Ireland. On the other side stood the Tuatha Dé Danann, radiant beings whose knowledge of magic, craft, and strategy made them seem almost supernatural. Their weapons were not only forged of bronze and iron, but also shaped by druidic skill and enchantment. The battle was fierce and relentless. Day after day, the 2 sides fought across the plain of Mag Tuired, neither willing to surrender the island that both believed belonged to them. The Fir Bolg were formidable opponents, stubborn and resilient, and for a time the outcome of the conflict remained uncertain. But slowly the balance shifted. The magic and ingenuity of the Tuatha Dé Danann began to overwhelm the raw strength of their adversaries. Victory, however, came with a terrible cost.
During the fighting, the king of the Tuatha Dé Danann, Nuada, lost his right arm in combat. In the brutal logic of ancient warfare, such a wound might have been expected, yet for the Tuatha Dé Danann, the loss carried consequences far beyond the battlefield. Because among these divine rulers, there existed a law, absolute and unbreakable. No blemished king could rule. Sovereignty, in their understanding, required physical perfection. A ruler must be whole, without flaw, embodying the ideal order of the world itself. Nuada, once the shining king of the Tuatha Dé Danann, was suddenly disqualified from the throne. And so, even in victory, the gods of Irish mythology faced a crisis of leadership. After much deliberation, they chose a new king. His name was Bress. At first glance, Bress seemed an ideal choice. He was handsome, eloquent, and charismatic. Yet beneath that polished surface lay a troubling truth. Bress was only half Tuatha Dé Danann. His father belonged to another race entirely, a race feared throughout Celtic mythology, the Fomorians. These beings were often described as monstrous and ancient, creatures of the sea in the desolate islands beyond the edges of the known world. They represented chaos, destruction, and the untamed forces of nature that threatened civilization. When Bress ascended the throne of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the consequences soon became clear. His rule was not merely ineffective, it was humiliating. The proud gods who had conquered Ireland found themselves treated like servants in their own land. Heavy taxes were imposed upon them, their champions were forced into degrading labor. The mighty Dagda, one of the greatest of the Celtic gods and goddesses, was compelled to dig trenches like a common worker. Ugma, the god of eloquence and strength, was ordered to carry firewood across the fields. The humiliation was systematic and deliberate, because Bress was not simply an incompetent ruler, he was a traitor. Through his rule, the influence of the Fomorians grew stronger within Ireland. It became increasingly clear that Bress was weakening the Tuatha Dé Danann from within, preparing the way for a conquest that would come not through diplomacy, but through domination. Yet, Irish mythology rarely leaves such imbalance unchallenged. Far from the throne, two figures were quietly working to restore what had been lost. Dian Siecht, the physician of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and the master craftsman Craidhne combined their extraordinary skills to perform a feat that seemed almost miraculous. They forged a new arm for the fallen king Nuada, not of flesh, but of shining silver. The arm was perfectly formed, fully articulated, capable of movement and strength as though it were living bone and muscle. With this restoration, Nuada became known forever in Celtic mythology as Nuada Ergit Lam, Nuada of the Silver Arm. And because he was once again physically whole, the ancient law of sovereignty allowed him to reclaim his throne. When Bress learned that Nuada had returned, he fled, but he did not disappear quietly. Instead, he sought refuge among his Fomorian kin and began gathering an army. A far greater war was now inevitable. The conflict that followed would not be a struggle between rival tribes or earthly kingdoms. It would become something much larger and far more terrifying. A battle between gods and monsters, between order and chaos, between the rising light of civilization and the dark power that waited beyond the sea. And at the center of that coming storm, another figure was preparing to step forward. A young warrior whose destiny would shape the future of Ireland itself. His name was Lugh, and in Irish mythology, Lugh was said to carry the light of the sun itself into battle.
Before we follow the armies of the Tuatha Dé Danann into the terrible clash that would become the Second Battle of Mag Tuired, it is worth pausing for a moment and returning to the beginning of their story. Back to those 4 distant cities in the far north of the world where their knowledge was first forged. In the quiet rhythm of mythology stories, certain objects carry more meaning than entire armies, and in Celtic mythology, the Tuatha Dé Danann arrived in ancient Ireland carrying 4 such objects. They were not merely weapons or tools, they were symbols of sovereignty itself, manifestations of what a perfect civilization was meant to be. The first of these treasures came from the city of Fairies. It was known as the Lia Fáil, the Stone of Destiny. In the old manuscripts of Irish mythology, this stone possessed a strange and powerful ability. When the rightful king of Ireland stood upon it, the stone would cry out. It would scream with a sound that echoed across the land, announcing that the person standing upon it had the legitimate right to rule. In a world where authority was often contested through bloodshed, the Lia Fáil represented something deeper than brute force. It represented the idea that kingship was not merely taken, but recognized by the land itself. Tradition holds that this stone still stands today upon the hill of Tara, the ancient ceremonial center of Ireland, where generations of rulers once came to be acknowledged as kings. The second treasure came from the city of Gorius, and it belonged to the warrior Lug, whose destiny was already beginning to shape the fate of Ireland. This was the spear of Lug, a weapon so fierce in its hunger for battle that it had to be submerged in a vessel of poppy seed or cooling liquid, otherwise it would ignite in flames and rush toward combat on its own. When Lug cast this spear in battle, the myths say it never missed its target. It moved with unstoppable precision, guided by a force beyond ordinary skill. And once its task was done, it always returned to the hand that had thrown it, ready for the next strike. The third treasure came from the city of Phineas. This was the sword of Nuada, the king whose silver arm had restored his right to rule. In the mythology explained through medieval manuscripts, the sword possessed an extraordinary quality. Once drawn from its sheath, no enemy could escape it. It was said to shine with such brilliance that those who faced it could scarcely endure the light. Some scholars of Celtic mythology have suggested that this legendary weapon may have influenced later stories of enchanted blades in European legend, including the famous sword Excalibur. Whether that connection is historical or poetic, the symbolism remains clear. The sword represented justice, the power to defend order against chaos. The fourth treasure came from the city of Murmurs, and it belonged to one of the most fascinating figures among the Celtic gods and goddesses, the Dagda. This was the cauldron of the Dagda, a great vessel that embodied abundance itself. In the mythology stories of ancient Ireland, no company ever left this cauldron unsatisfied. It could feed entire armies without ever emptying. Some legends even suggested that the cauldron possessed the power to restore life to the fallen, making it a symbol not only of nourishment, but of renewal. Taken together, these 4 treasures formed something like a blueprint for a balanced civilization. The Stone of Destiny represented legitimate authority, the right to rule acknowledged by the land. The spear represented military power, the strength to defend that authority. The sword represented justice, the moral force that ensured power was not abused, and the cauldron represented prosperity, the abundance that allowed society to flourish. With these treasures in their possession, the Tuatha Dé Danann were more than conquerors. They became the architects of a golden age in ancient Ireland, a time when harmony between leadership, strength, justice, and abundance created a vision of perfect order. But golden ages rarely last forever, because somewhere beyond the horizon, another fleet was already approaching Ireland. This time, the invaders would not be monsters rising from the sea, nor gods descending from the clouds. They would be something far more dangerous in the long arc of history. They would be human.
The end of the age of gods did not begin with thunder or fire. It began quietly, with the stillness of a funeral. In the stories preserved within Irish history and Irish mythology, 3 goddesses stood upon a hill overlooking the western sea. The wind carried the scent of salt across the cliffs, and on the horizon a fleet of dark ships slowly approached the shores of ancient Ireland. The goddesses knew what was coming long before the ships reached land. Divine sight carries a terrible clarity, and Eriu, Banba, and Fodla could already see the shape of the future unfolding. The world they had ruled, the shining age of the Tuatha Dé Danann, was nearing its end. The fleet belonged to the sons of Meal Espania, a people remembered in Irish history as the Malaysians. According to tradition, they had come from Iberia, from the distant lands that lie across the sea where Spain now stands. Unlike the radiant Tuatha Dé Danann, these newcomers were mortal in every sense of the word. They possessed no divine immortality, no ancient mastery of druidic magic inherited from the cities of the north. Their lives were brief, their bodies fragile. Yet mortality often carries a different kind of strength, one forged through urgency and determination. The Malaysians were clever sailors and relentless explorers, driven by a belief that Ireland was destined to become their homeland. Among them traveled a figure who would change the fate of the island not with a sword, but with words. His name was Amergin. In Celtic mythology, he is remembered as a poet and a druid, a man whose voice carried the power of incantation. In ancient Ireland, the poet was not merely a storyteller. The poet shaped reality itself through language. Words were believed to possess weight and force, capable of bending the world if spoken with enough wisdom. When the Malaysian ships finally reached the coast, the Tuatha Dé Danann did not greet them with armies. Instead, the three goddesses approached the newcomers upon the shore. Eriu, Banba, and Fodla were not merely guardians of the land. They were embodiments of Ireland itself, the living spirit of the island in its three sacred aspects. Each goddess made the same request to Amergin and his people. If the Malaysians intended to claim the island, they must promise to name the land after her. It was a quiet negotiation, but one filled with the weight of destiny. Amergin listened carefully to each goddess. When he spoke, he gave his word to Eriu that her name would become the principal name of the island forever. And so it remains today, Ireland, Eri, a land forever carrying the name of a goddess who knew in that moment that the rule of the Tuatha Dé Danann was fading. Yet the Tuatha Dé Danann were not prepared to surrender their kingdom so easily. Though they possessed immense power within the landscape of ancient Ireland, they attempted to drive the Malaysian fleet back into the sea with one final act of druidic magic. A storm rose suddenly from the waters, winds howled across the ocean, and waves battered the ships, threatening to scatter them before they could land. For a moment it seemed the old gods might prevail. But Amergin stepped forward onto the deck of his ship and raised his voice above the roaring wind. He spoke a poem, a chant so ancient and powerful that later tradition would remember it as the first poem ever spoken in Ireland. I am a wind upon the sea. I am a wave of the ocean. I am the roar of the sea. I am a stag of 7 tines. I am a hawk upon a cliff. I am a teardrop of the sun. These words did more than describe the world. They became the world. In the language of Celtic mythology, Amergin was not merely speaking about Ireland, he was claiming unity with it. By naming the forces of nature, he placed himself within them. The storm began to calm, the wind softened, the Malaysian ships continued forward. In that moment, something extraordinary happened. The old gods realized they had encountered a different kind of power. Not the immortality of divine beings, nor the ancient magic of the Tuatha Dé Danann, but the creative force of human language and imagination. Against such power, even gods must sometimes yield.
What followed the arrival of the Milesians was not the kind of ending one might expect from mythology stories filled with war and conquest. The Tuatha Dé Danann were not annihilated, nor were they driven into exile across distant seas. Instead, something far stranger unfolded in the landscape of ancient Ireland. There was negotiation, there was compromise, and there was an agreement that would reshape Irish mythology forever. The Milesians, newly arrived yet determined to claim the island, faced opponents who were older than memory and woven deeply into the fabric of the land itself. The Tuatha Dé Danann had ruled Ireland during what later storytellers would remember as a golden age, a time when the Celtic gods and goddesses walked openly upon the hills and rivers of the island. Yet even gods understand when the tide of history has begun to turn. Rather than destroy the mortal newcomers in one final catastrophic war, the Tuatha Dé Danann chose a different path. The island would be divided, but not in the way kingdoms are usually divided on maps. There would be no border cutting across valleys or mountains, no line separating north from south or east from west. The division would be vertical. The Milesians would rule the surface world, the bright and visible Ireland of fields, rivers, forests, and sky. They would become the ancestors of the Gaelic Irish remembered in Irish history. The Tuatha Dé Danann, meanwhile, would withdraw beneath the land itself. They would rule the hidden dimension that lay inside the hills, within the winding passages beneath ancient mounds, and within those strange spaces that seemed to exist just beyond the edge of ordinary perception. Each of the great gods was given a Sidhe, a sacred mound that would serve as their dwelling place. These Sidhe were not merely burial sites or earthen hills. In the imagination of Celtic mythology, they were gateways into another world, entrances into the luminous realm later known as the Otherworld. The Dagda, the great father figure among the Celtic gods and goddesses, claimed the magnificent mound of Brú na Bóinne, the vast complex that modern archaeology identifies with Newgrange. This ancient monument, built thousands of years before the arrival of the Celts, became the royal seat of divine power beneath the earth. Yet even within the realm of the gods, stories of cunning and cleverness continued to unfold. The Dagda's son Aengus eventually claimed Brú na Bóinne for himself through a trick of language, asking only to stay within the mound for a day and a night, a phrase that in poetic interpretation meant eternity. In this way, the mythology stories of ancient Ireland reveal that even divine realms are shaped by wit as much as strength. Overseeing the retreat of the Tuatha Dé Danann was another enigmatic figure, Manannán mac Lir, the great sea god of Celtic mythology. In many legends, he appears as a guide between worlds, a master of illusion and mist. According to tradition, it was Manannán who organized the great withdrawal beneath the hills. To protect the hidden dwellings of the gods, he cast a powerful enchantment known as the Faith Fiada over each sacred mound. This magical veil concealed the entrances to the Sidhe from mortal eyes. To ordinary travelers crossing the Irish countryside, the mounds appeared as simple hills or grassy rises in the landscape. But beneath them lay halls of brilliance and wonder, invisible yet enduring. And so the Tuatha Dé Danann vanished from the visible world. They were not destroyed, they were not banished, they were hidden. Over time, their name began to change in the language of Irish mythology. They became known as the Aos Sí, the people of the mounds. In later traditions, the name evolved again into the Aos Sí, a term still used in Ireland to refer to the hidden folk. Other names followed as the centuries passed: the Downey Sí, the good neighbors, the gentry. Each name carried the same quiet respect, an acknowledgement that these beings remained present within the land, even if they were no longer seen openly. Eventually, another name would emerge, one that would travel far beyond Ireland and enter the imagination of the modern world. A small word, deceptively simple, a word that would shrink the grandeur of ancient gods into something delicate and childlike. The Tuatha Dé Danann, rulers of ancient Ireland, would come to be known by that final name, Fairies. Yet the otherworld into which they withdrew was not merely a network of underground chambers beneath grassy hills. It was something far more mysterious. A realm where the laws of time flowed differently, where years might pass in the mortal world while only a single night unfolded beneath the Sidhe.
a realm where death, memory, and reality itself bent into unfamiliar shapes. And it is into that strange and beautiful dimension that our story must now travel. Because to understand the fair folk of Irish mythology, we must understand the nature of the otherworld itself.
Time, as we understand it in the human world, does not exist in the otherworld. The stories preserved across Irish mythology and Celtic mythology describe a place where time stretches, folds, and bends in ways that seem impossible to the mortal mind. A traveler might step through the entrance of a fairy mound at dusk, spend what feels like a single evening in a great hall of music and laughter, and return home only to discover that centuries have passed in the world they left behind. Entire generations vanish in the space of a dance. Families turn to dust. Kingdoms rise and fall, while the traveler believes only a night has passed. These strange distortions of time appear again and again in mythology explained through ancient folklore, suggesting that the otherworld was never imagined as a simple underground kingdom. It was something closer to another dimension, a realm governed by different principles of reality. Among the many stories for sleep that illustrate this idea, none is more famous than the legend of Oisin. Oisin was the son of the legendary hero Fionn mac Cumhaill, leader of the Fianna, the warrior band whose exploits echo throughout Irish mythology. In the tales of ancient Ireland, Oisin is remembered not only as a warrior, but as a poet, a man whose life stood at the boundary between myth and history. One evening, as the story unfolds, a woman rode across the sea on a white horse that seemed to glide over the waves themselves. Her name was Neem of the Golden Hair, and she belonged to the Tuatha Dé Danann, the hidden people who had retreated beneath the hills of Ireland after the coming of mortals. Neem invited Oisin to ride with her to Tir Nanog, the land of the young, a radiant realm across the western sea where age and sorrow did not exist. Oisin accepted, and together they crossed the ocean into the otherworld. What he found there was a place of perfect beauty. In Tir Nanog, the forests were always green, the halls always filled with music, and the feasts never ended. Oisin hunted across golden plains, rode through valleys of sunlight, and lived in happiness beside Neem. The years passed gently, almost unnoticed. 3 years, he believed. But even in paradise, memory has its pull. Slowly, like the rising tide along the coast of ancient Ireland, homesickness grew in Oisin's heart. He began to long for the hills of his homeland and the companions of the Fianna. Seeing his sorrow, Neem finally agreed to let him return for a brief visit. Yet she gave him a warning that echoed through the logic of Celtic mythology. He must not dismount from the white horse. He must not allow his feet to touch the soil of Ireland. If he did, the spell protecting him from time would break. Oisin rode back across the sea, expecting to see the world he had left behind only a few years earlier. But when he reached the shores of Ireland, he found something entirely different. The land itself seemed older. The warriors of the Fianna were gone. The great halls of Fionn had fallen silent. Christianity had spread across the island, and the ancient heroes of Irish mythology had already faded into legend. Oisin soon realized the terrible truth. While he believed he had lived only 3 years in the otherworld, 300 years had passed in the mortal world. Lost and bewildered, he rode through the unfamiliar countryside until he encountered a group of men struggling to lift a heavy stone. Seeing their difficulty, Oisin leaned down from the saddle to help them. In that moment, the saddle strap snapped. His foot touched the earth, and instantly the centuries fell upon him.
The young warrior of the Fianna became an old man in a single breath. His hair turned white, his body withered, and the strength of youth vanished as if it had never existed. The earth that had forgotten him claimed him once more. The story of Oisin is not only a tragedy whispered in stories for sleep, it is a lesson woven into the heart of Celtic mythology. The otherworld is not simply a hidden kingdom, it is a place where time itself behaves differently. And for those who wander there, the greatest danger is not monsters or magic, it is the quiet and patient cruelty of time.
So, if the elasticity of time reveals one strange law of the otherworld, there is another law that is darker, quieter, and far more unsettling. In the folklore that survives within Irish mythology and Celtic mythology, immortality is never truly free. It carries a price. The fair folk, those descendants of the Tuatha Dé Danann who dwell within the hollow hills of ancient Ireland, possess beauty that does not fade and lifespans that stretch far beyond those of mortals. Their halls shimmer with music, their feasts never end, their faces remain young long after human kingdoms have risen and fallen. Yet beneath this shimmering perfection lies a secret obligation whispered across countless mythology stories. Every 7 years, the fairy courts must pay a tithe. This payment is known in old folklore as the Tynd, and the tribute is not gold, it is not cattle or grain, it is souls. The belief appears again and again in medieval ballads and oral tradition, suggesting that even the seemingly immortal beings of the otherworld exist within a cosmic balance that they cannot escape. Among the many stories for sleep that preserve this haunting idea, none is more poignant than the ballad of Tam Lin. Tam Lin begins not as a mythic hero, but as a mortal man, a young knight who wanders into the forbidden woods of Carterhaugh. In Celtic mythology, forests often function as thresholds between worlds, places where the boundary between the mortal realm and the hidden world of the fair folk grows thin. It was there that Tam Lin encountered the Fairy Queen. She took him into the otherworld where he lived as one of her knights within the glittering halls beneath the hills. At first, the life might have seemed enviable. The otherworld was a place of beauty, music, and endless celebration. But Tam Lin eventually came to understand a terrible truth about the fairy realm. He was not truly a guest, he was a kind of currency. In 7 years, when the cycle of the Tynd returned, his soul would be offered to darker forces beyond the fairy court. And so Tam Lin lived with the quiet knowledge that the paradise surrounding him was only temporary. His story might have ended there, swallowed by the strange economy of the otherworld, if not for a woman named Janet. Janet was a mortal who encountered Tam Lin in the forest and came to love him despite the danger surrounding his fate. When Tam Lin revealed the truth to her, he also told her how she might break the cycle that bound him. On the night of Samhain, the ancient festival that later became Halloween, the fairy host would ride across the land in a spectral procession. Among them would be Tam Lin himself. Janet must wait beside the road as the riders passed. When Tam Lin appeared, she must seize him and pull him from his horse. But the challenge would not end there. The fair folk would attempt to reclaim him through transformation. They would turn him into terrifying shapes in order to frighten her into releasing her grip. A serpent twisting with venom, a burning coal that scorched the hands, a roaring lion with blazing eyes. Janet must hold him through every transformation. She must not let go. And so the night arrived. The wind moved through the dark forests, and the fairy riders thundered across the land like shadows racing through moonlight. When Tam Lin passed her on his horse, Janet leapt forward and pulled him down. Instantly, the transformations began. His body twisted into monstrous shapes, each more terrifying than the last. Yet Janet held him tightly, refusing to release him despite the fear and pain.
Finally, the final transformation ended, and Tam Lin lay in her arms once again as a human man. The Fairy Queen's voice echoed across the darkness, filled with bitter fury. Had she known what would happen that night, she said, she would have taken Tam Lin's eyes and replaced them with wooden ones so that no mortal woman could ever love him. Yet the spell had been broken. Tam Lin was free. This haunting tale reveals something essential about the metaphysics of the other world. Beauty exists there, but it is balanced by obligation. Immortality exists there, but it demands payment. The fair folk themselves are caught within a system of cosmic exchange that they cannot entirely escape. And so they continue to search for mortals, sometimes luring them through music or enchantment, sometimes inviting them into their halls beneath the hills, not always out of cruelty, sometimes simply because the ancient economy of the other world requires it. Yet the fairy realm is not a single unified society. Just like the mortal world, it contains factions, rival courts, and divisions of power. Some among the fair folk are generous and luminous, while others move through shadow with colder intentions. And to understand those divisions, we must now look more closely at the structure of fairy society itself.
If the other world possesses laws of time and hidden economies of souls, it also possesses something that feels surprisingly familiar to human experience. It has structure, it has hierarchy, it has politics. In the old traditions preserved across fairy folklore in the Scottish lowlands and the Gaelic world, storytellers often spoke of two great courts that governed the hidden society of the fair folk. These courts were not divided in the simple way that human stories often divide their characters into good and evil. The fairy world is rarely that straightforward. Instead, the difference between the courts lay in something subtler and more revealing. One court followed rules, the other did not. The first of these was known as the Seelie Court. The word Seelie comes from an old Scots term meaning blessed, fortunate, or happy. Yet in the language of fairy folklore, the word does not mean that these beings were gentle or compassionate in the way humans understand kindness. The Seelie Court was not kind in the emotional sense. The fair folk of the Seelie Court did not feel empathy the way mortals do. They did not comfort the grieving or protect humanity out of moral concern. But they did possess a concept that was almost as powerful as kindness. They possessed fairness. In the strange social order of the fairy world, fairness meant that actions produced consequences according to recognizable rules. If a mortal showed respect to the Seelie Court, that respect might be rewarded. If a mortal showed arrogance or insult, punishment might follow. Yet, unlike the darker factions of the other world, the Seelie did not inflict cruelty without reason. Their responses tended to mirror the behavior they received. In this way, the Seelie Court functioned almost like an ancient bureaucracy within Celtic mythology, a structured system of obligation, etiquette, and reciprocity that governed interactions between humans and the hidden world. Throughout ancient Ireland and Scotland, countless small customs developed around this relationship. Farmers whose crops struggled through harsh seasons might leave offerings beside old standing stones or at the edges of a fairy mound. A bowl of milk, a small loaf of bread, a pat of fresh butter. These were not acts of worship in the religious sense. They were gestures of acknowledgement. In the worldview shaped by Celtic gods explained through folklore, the land itself remained inhabited by unseen neighbors who deserved recognition. When the Seelie Court was properly acknowledged, stories often tell of subtle assistance offered in return. A farmer might wake to find a field mysteriously cleared of stones. A household might notice that butter churned more easily in summer after leaving cream at the doorstep on May Eve. Livestock might thrive while neighboring herds struggled. These gifts were rarely dramatic or theatrical. The fair folk of the Seelie court preferred quiet influence rather than spectacular miracles. Their presence revealed itself through small adjustments in fortune that accumulated over time. Equally important were the rules surrounding sacred places within the landscape. Across ancient Ireland, there exist circular earthworks known as fairy forts, ancient rings of raised soil that dot the countryside. Even in modern times, many farmers refuse to plow directly through these structures. Instead, they curve their fields around them, leaving the ancient mounds untouched. In fairy folklore, this behavior is not superstition, but etiquette. A farmer who respects a fairy fort acknowledges the presence of the hidden court beneath the land. Such respect might be rewarded with prosperity. A farmer who destroys such a mound risks attracting the attention of the Seelie court in a far less favorable way. Yet, despite these interactions, the relationship between mortals and the Seelie court always remained delicate. These beings were not human allies. They belonged to a civilization older and stranger than the mortal world, a society that evolved from the ancient Tuatha Dé Danann, who once ruled Ireland before retreating beneath the hills. To encounter them was to enter a negotiation with forces that followed their own logic. Respect could bring reward, disrespect could bring consequence, but everything depended on understanding the rules. Yet if the Seelie court represented the structured and rule-bound face of the fairy world, there existed another court that reflected something far older and far more dangerous. In the traditions preserved within fairy folklore across Scotland and ancient Ireland, this darker faction was known as the Unseelie court. The word itself is simple. Unseelie means unblessed, unfortunate, or ill-favored. But within Celtic mythology, the word carried a deeper implication. These beings did not recognize the social contract that governed the Seelie court. They owed nothing to mortals. They responded to no offerings. Courtesy did not soften them. Respect did not appease them. They acted according to impulse, appetite, and ancient instincts that predated human civilization. If the Seelie court resembled a kind of hidden bureaucracy beneath the hills, the Unseelie court resembled something closer to a storm. It could not be negotiated with, it could only be avoided. In many mythology stories preserved by rural communities, encounters with the Unseelie were described not as social interactions, but as hazards of the landscape, like dangerous currents in a river or sudden winter storms rolling across the hills. One of the most feared groups associated with the Unseelie court was the Sloog. In fairy folklore, the Sloog were said to be the restless host of unforgiven dead, spirits who had not found peace and who had been gathered into the dark armies of the fairy world. They traveled in vast flocks across the night sky, often described as a cold, rushing wind filled with whispers and wings. The Sloog always came from the west. In Celtic cosmology, the West was associated with the direction of the other world, the place beyond the setting sun where souls traveled after death. Because of this belief, many people in ancient Ireland and the Scottish Highlands avoided leaving west-facing windows open at night. The fear was simple and deeply unsettling. The Sloog might reach inside and steal the soul of someone who was dying before that soul could receive its final blessings. In this way, the Unseelie court represented not simply malicious creatures, but a darker reflection of mortality itself, a reminder that death and the supernatural world were never far apart in the worldview of ancient Celtic cultures. Yet the Sloog were not the only inhabitants of this shadowed court. Among the most infamous figures of Unseelie folklore were the Redcaps. These creatures were said to haunt ruined castles and abandoned border fortresses along the turbulent frontier between England and Scotland. Unlike the elegant fair folk of the Seelie court, Redcaps were small, twisted, and ancient in appearance, their faces creased like weathered stone, and their eyes glittering with feral intelligence.
Their name came from a grisly detail that storytellers repeated again and again. The caps that these creatures wore were dyed red in human blood, but the color could not be allowed to fade. If the blood dried, the red cap would weaken and die. And so they killed constantly, attacking travelers who wandered into the wrong ruins at the wrong hour of night. The red cap stories served a practical function as well as a mythological one. Borderlands during the medieval period were violent and dangerous places, filled with raiders, bandits, and crumbling fortifications that could shelter predators of the human variety. By framing these dangers through fairy folklore, communities created a narrative that explained why certain places should be avoided after dark. Yet within Celtic mythology, these tales also carried a deeper meaning. The Unseelie Court reminds us that the fairy world was never imagined as a perfect paradise hidden beneath the hills. It was a mirror of the mortal world. It possessed beauty and wonder, but also cruelty, ambition, and hunger for power. Like any civilization, the fairy world contained factions and hierarchies, rulers and rebels, alliances and rivalries. And mortals who lived beside that invisible society understood something very important. Survival did not depend on bravery alone. It depended on knowledge. Knowing which hills to avoid, knowing which knights belonged to the fair folk, knowing when to leave milk at the doorstep and when to lock the windows against the western wind. Because in the end, dear listener, the fairy courts did not merely inhabit the same land as humans. They shared the same world, and the boundary between those worlds was never as solid as we might wish.
So if the fairy world possesses courts, hierarchies, and its own strange metaphysics, then it also possesses something even more fundamental. It possesses rules. Across the entire landscape of fairy folklore, from the wind-swept hills of Scotland to the green valleys of ancient Ireland, one lesson appears again and again with remarkable consistency. There are rules governing contact between mortals and the fair folk. These rules are not suggestions. They are not customs that can be ignored without consequence. They are laws. And like the quiet laws of gravity or tide, they operate whether humans understand them or not. Among all of these ancient laws, none appears more frequently in dark folklore than the taboo of iron. Iron, cold iron, was believed to be the most reliable protection against the powers of the fair folk. Throughout Celtic tradition, people developed a quiet system of protective rituals that revolved around this metal. A horseshoe nailed above a doorway, an iron nail hidden in the wooden frame of a cradle, a small pair of iron scissors left open beneath a pillow where a newborn child slept. To modern observers, these gestures might appear to be simple superstition, the kind of folk practice that grows naturally in isolated rural communities. But within the deeper context of mythology explained through history, these rituals tell a far older story. They were not merely symbolic, they were survival protocols passed from generation to generation. In countless stories for sleep preserved in the oral tradition of Ireland and Scotland, iron appears again and again as the one substance that the fair folk cannot tolerate. A traveler lost on a dark road might carry an iron knife for protection. A farmer building a new home might embed iron tools into the threshold of the doorway. Mothers were particularly careful because fairy folklore insisted that newborn children were especially vulnerable to the attention of the other world. Iron objects placed near the cradle acted as a boundary, a quiet signal to the unseen world that the child was protected by the metal of the mortal realm. But the question remains, why iron? Why should such a simple metal carry such power in the stories of Celtic mythology? The answer may lie not in magic, but in memory. Archaeologists and historians have long observed that the mythological conflict between the Tuatha Dé Danann and the later Gaelic peoples may preserve echoes of real historical change. The Tuatha Dé Danann, the radiant beings who once ruled Ireland according to myth, seem to represent an earlier civilization remembered through legend, a culture associated with the Bronze Age or perhaps even older Neolithic traditions. The later arrivals, the Milesians of Irish mythology, belonged to a world transformed by a revolutionary technology: ironworking. Iron was stronger than bronze. It held a sharper edge. It could cut through weapons and armor that bronze could not withstand. In purely practical terms, the societies that mastered iron technology gained enormous advantages in warfare, agriculture, and construction. When iron entered Ireland, the balance of power shifted dramatically. Old ways gave way to new ones, and within the long memory of folklore, that transformation may have been preserved in symbolic form. The metal that conquered the old civilization became the metal that the old gods feared. In this interpretation, the iron taboo is not simply fairy folklore, it is the fossilized memory of technological conquest, a historical trauma preserved within the mythological imagination. Iron became the metal of the New World, the metal that belonged to mortal civilization rather than the hidden courts beneath the hills. The fair folk descended from the defeated Tuatha Dé Danann in the storytelling traditions of ancient Ireland were said to recoil from it because it represented the force that ended their reign. And so the people of Ireland and Scotland carried iron not simply as a tool, but as a quiet declaration of belonging. It marked the boundary between the human world and the other world. This is why the stories insist that iron burns the fair folk like fire, that it breaks their enchantments and disrupts their power. The metal itself is not magical. What it represents is the triumph of the mortal age over the age of gods. In this way, the iron taboo reminds us of something deeply unsettling about mythology. Many myths are not fantasies at all. They are memories wearing masks. If iron represents the boundary that separates the mortal world from the hidden realm of the fair folk, then there exists another law just as powerful, though far more subtle. It is a rule repeated in nearly every strand of fairy folklore across Europe, from ancient Ireland to the Highlands of Scotland and beyond. The rule is simple, but its consequences are profound. Never eat the food of the fairies. Within the long tradition of Celtic mythology and dark folklore, this prohibition appears again and again, whispered like a warning passed from elder to child across centuries. Travelers who wander into the other world are always told the same thing: do not taste the fruit, do not drink the wine, do not accept the feast, because the moment a mortal consumes food belonging to the fair folk, something irreversible begins to happen. The bond between the mortal world and the traveler is quietly severed. The change is rarely immediate. At first, the other world simply seems more vivid. The colors feel richer. Music carries a sweetness that human ears have never known. Time slows, as if the air itself is thick with enchantment. The food tastes extraordinary, far beyond anything produced in the mortal world. Fruits burst with sweetness, bread is impossibly soft and fragrant, wine glows like liquid sunlight. But this beauty conceals a deeper transformation that unfolds slowly within the human body and mind. In many mythology stories preserved in the folklore of Scotland and Ireland, those who eat fairy food find that ordinary life becomes unbearable once they return to the mortal world. The fields appear dull, the air tastes flat, food seems dry and flavorless. The senses themselves have been altered. Having tasted the other world, the mortal world can no longer satisfy them.
This rule echoes across many mythological traditions beyond the Celtic lands. In Greek mythology, the story of Persephone carries the same warning. Persephone, the daughter of Demeter, is taken into the underworld by Hades. While there, she eats 6 seeds of the pomegranate, and that small act binds her forever to the realm of the dead. Each year, she must return there because the food of the underworld has marked her as belonging partly to that world. The same pattern appears in the Scottish legend of Thomas the Rhymer. Thomas encounters the Queen of Elfland and travels with her into the fairy realm. Before they arrive, she gives him a warning that echoes through countless stories for sleep. He must not eat or drink anything in Elfland, or he will never return to the mortal world again. The Queen understands the law that governs her own realm. Consumption creates belonging. To share food is to share existence. But beyond the mythological symbolism, this rule contains something that modern readers may recognize in an unexpectedly familiar way. The transformation described in fairy folklore resembles the mechanics of addiction. The pleasures of the otherworld provide an intensity that the mortal world cannot match. Once experienced, ordinary life feels empty by comparison. The victim becomes trapped not by chains or imprisonment, but by desire. The fairy realm does not need to force anyone to remain there. Those who have tasted its pleasures often find that they cannot truly live anywhere else again. In this sense, the prohibition against fairy food functions as a metaphor for temptation itself. The otherworld offers experiences that seem beautiful and harmless at first, yet they slowly reshape the person who encounters them. Desire replaces belonging. Enchantment replaces freedom, and the boundary between worlds grows harder to cross with every passing moment. That is why the old stories repeat the warning so often. If you ever wander into the halls beneath the hills, if music leads you through mist and moonlight into the company of the fair folk, remember this single rule above all others: do not eat their food, because the moment you do, the path back to the mortal world may begin to fade forever.
If iron forms the boundary between the mortal world and the hidden realm, and if the food of the fair folk binds the soul to the other world, then there exists one final law that governs contact between humans and the beings beneath the hills. It is a law that appears again and again throughout Celtic mythology, fairy folklore, and the quiet traditions of ancient Ireland and Scotland. The law concerns something deceptively simple: a name. In the modern world, names are little more than labels. They help us identify one another, but they carry no deeper authority. Yet in the worldview of the old Celtic cultures, a name was never merely a sound. A name was power. To know the true name of a thing was to understand its essence, and to understand its essence was, in a subtle way, to hold influence over it. This belief appears across countless mythology stories preserved in oral tradition. The fair folk themselves were rarely called fairies in the villages of Ireland or the Scottish Highlands. That word was considered dangerously direct. To speak of them too plainly was believed to attract their attention, and the attention of the otherworld was rarely something a mortal wished to invite. Instead, people developed an elaborate language of respectful substitutions. They were called the good people, the good neighbors, the gentry, the fair folk, the wee folk, the people of peace, the hidden ones. Each of these titles served a delicate purpose. They were compliments disguised as descriptions, small offerings of politeness meant to soothe beings who were known to be easily offended. To name them kindly was to acknowledge their presence without challenging their pride. It was a linguistic ritual that functioned much like leaving milk beside a fairy mound or bread on the windowsill. Words themselves became offerings. In fairy folklore, the danger of true names appears repeatedly.
The fair folk guard their names with remarkable care because they understand something that humans have largely forgotten. A true name is not simply identification, it is a key. In some stories, a mortal who discovers the true name of a fairy can command it, dismiss it, or break the enchantments it has cast. The name becomes a lever capable of shifting the balance of power between worlds. This pattern appears so consistently across folklore that it eventually spread into stories far removed from the Celtic lands. Perhaps the most famous example is the tale of Rumpelstiltskin, in which a mysterious being spins straw into gold but demands a terrible price in return. The young woman who bargains with him can only escape the bargain if she discovers his true name. When she finally speaks that name aloud, the creature's power collapses instantly. The story may have been recorded centuries later in continental Europe, but the pattern it follows is much older. It reflects the ancient belief that names shape reality. In Celtic mythology, poets and druids were believed to wield this kind of power through language itself. Words were not merely communication, they were instruments capable of altering the world. The poet Amerigan, who claimed Ireland through the power of his incantation during the Milesian conquest, is one of the clearest examples of this belief. His poem did not simply describe the land, it became the land. In that worldview, the act of naming was an act of transformation. The fair folk understood this principle better than anyone. That is why their true names remained hidden behind layers of courtesy and euphemism. Mortals who spoke carefully could coexist with the unseen world. Mortals who spoke foolishly might find that the veil between worlds had suddenly grown very thin. And so, dear listener, language itself became one of the quiet defenses against the supernatural. People did not challenge the fair folk directly. They flattered them. They softened their references. They spoke indirectly, as though addressing powerful neighbors whose pride must never be wounded. Because in the long memory of fairy folklore, there is a simple truth that echoes through every story. Words can summon, words can bind, and words, when spoken with the wrong name, can open doors that were meant to remain closed.
A mother puts her child to bed, healthy and laughing. The small room smells faintly of warm milk and peat smoke from the hearth. Outside, the wind moves softly across the Irish hills, brushing the grass around an old fairy mound that has stood there longer than memory. The baby sleeps peacefully in the cradle, its small chest rising and falling with the gentle rhythm of dreams. Nothing seems unusual. Nothing seems dangerous. But in the long memory of Irish folklore and fairy folklore, night is rarely as quiet as it appears. Morning arrives. The mother wakes and moves toward the cradle, expecting to hear the same familiar cooing sound that greeted her yesterday. Yet the moment she lifts the blanket, something inside her tightens. The child looks the same. The face is the same shape. The tiny hands still curl against the blanket, but the eyes open in a way that feels wrong, too knowing, too old. The cry that follows is sharp and unfamiliar, a sound that does not belong to the infant she carried in her arms the night before. And somewhere deep in her bones, older than language itself, the mother feels a certainty she cannot explain. This is not my child. This chilling moment forms the heart of one of the most enduring and unsettling beliefs in Celtic mythology and Irish folklore, the Changeling. According to the tradition preserved across centuries of storytelling, the fair folk sometimes stole healthy human infants and replaced them with one of their own. The replacement child, known as a changeling, was rarely a true infant. Often the creature left behind was said to be an elderly fairy, one nearing the end of its unnatural life,
hidden beneath a glamour that made it resemble the stolen child. At first, the illusion might appear convincing, but over time, strange differences began to reveal themselves. The changeling might refuse food or cry endlessly through the night. Its body might remain weak and frail, failing to grow as human children should. In some mythology stories, the creature would display unsettling intelligence, staring at adults with an expression far older than childhood. In others, it would mutter strange phrases or laugh at moments when laughter seemed impossible. These details appear again and again throughout dark folklore across Ireland, Scotland, and parts of Northern Europe. But the question always lingered in the frightened minds of the families who believed these stories. Why would the fairies take human children at all? Irish folklore offers several answers, each reflecting a different attempt to explain the mystery. Some traditions suggested that the fairy race, the hidden descendants of the Tuatha Dé Danann who had retreated beneath the hills after the Milesian conquest, had begun to weaken with age. Human blood, vibrant and mortal, might strengthen their fading vitality. Others believed the stolen children were connected to the ancient tithe known as the Tend, the 7-year offering that the fairy courts were said to pay to darker forces beneath the earth. A human child might serve as the tribute required to maintain the fragile balance of the other world. Yet among all these explanations, there exists one that feels strangely sad rather than sinister. Some storytellers believed the fairies took human children simply because they loved them. The fairy world, for all its beauty, was not a place built for human emotion. It possessed splendor and immortality, but it lacked something fragile and chaotic that mortals possess in abundance. Love that grows imperfectly, love that changes and breaks and heals again. The fair folk had traded their mortality for eternity, and in doing so, they had lost the warmth that mortality brings. Human children, with their laughter and unpredictability, carried a spark of life that the fairy world could not easily create. And so, according to the gentlest version of the legend, the fairies did not steal children out of cruelty. They took them because they longed for something they themselves could never fully possess again. Yet, as unsettling as the changeling belief may sound to modern ears, there is another layer to this story, one that reveals something deeply human beneath the shadows of dark folklore. When scholars began examining the vast body of changeling legends preserved across Irish folklore and Celtic mythology, they noticed something remarkable. The descriptions of these supposed fairy replacements followed a very consistent pattern. The child that remained in the cradle was described as weak, sickly, unable to grow normally. Sometimes the child refused food. Sometimes it cried constantly through the night with a thin, piercing voice that exhausted the entire household. In other cases, the child appeared strangely distant, unresponsive to voices or gestures that would normally attract an infant's attention. Some changeling children were said to sit silently for long periods, staring into space, as if they were listening to something no one else could hear. These details appear with such consistency across centuries of fairy folklore that historians and medical researchers began to ask an uncomfortable question. What if the changeling stories were not simply myths about supernatural theft? What if they were attempts by pre-modern societies to explain medical conditions they did not yet understand? Many of the symptoms described in changeling legends correspond strikingly with developmental disorders that modern medicine recognizes today. Children with conditions such as autism spectrum disorder, Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, or metabolic diseases sometimes exhibit developmental changes that can appear sudden and frightening to parents who expect a child to follow a familiar pattern of growth. A baby who previously responded to voices may suddenly become quiet and withdrawn. A child who seemed healthy might begin to lose weight or fail to develop physically.
In a world without pediatric medicine, genetics, or neurological science, such transformations would have been almost impossible to explain rationally. The language available to medieval communities came not from science, but from mythology. The framework of fairy folklore offered an explanation that fit the emotional experience of the parents. The child had not changed. The real child had been taken. What remained in the cradle was something else entirely. From a psychological perspective, this belief may have provided a strange form of protection for grieving families. It allowed parents to imagine that the beloved child they remembered still existed somewhere beyond the hills, living among the fair folk, while the fragile or suffering child before them was only a temporary substitute. In this way, the changeling myth acted as a bridge between unbearable reality and the human need to make sense of suffering. Yet the tragedy of the belief lies in the desperate methods people sometimes used to prove whether a child was a changeling. In many mythology stories and historical records, families were told that if the creature in the cradle truly belonged to the fair folk, pain or shock would force it to reveal its true nature and flee back to the other world. And so a series of brutal tests emerged within dark folklore. The suspected changeling might be left outside overnight on a lonely hilltop, exposed to cold wind and rain. It might be placed upon a hot shovel or held dangerously close to the hearth fire. Some traditions recommended bathing the child in foxglove tea. Foxglove contains digitalis, a powerful compound that affects the heart and can easily become poisonous. To those administering the treatment, the logic seemed brutally simple. If the being in the cradle was a fairy disguised as a child, the pain would break the enchantment. The real child would return. But if the child truly belonged to the mortal world, the consequences could be fatal. The heartbreaking reality, revealed through court records and parish histories across Ireland and Scotland, is that many children did not survive these tests. Their deaths became part of the silent historical background behind the myth of changelings. And so the changeling phenomenon stands today as a haunting intersection between folklore and medicine. It reminds us that mythology does not only emerge from imagination. Sometimes it grows from confusion, fear, and the desperate need to explain suffering in a world that lacks the tools to understand it. By the end of the 19th century, the world had changed in ways that the old storytellers of fairy folklore could scarcely have imagined. Railways crossed the Irish countryside. Telegraph wires carried messages faster than any horse could run. Science and medicine were beginning to illuminate mysteries that had troubled humanity for centuries. And yet, deep in the rural landscapes of Ireland, the ancient beliefs of Celtic mythology and Irish folklore had not vanished. They lingered quietly among the fields and stone cottages, woven into the rhythms of daily life. It was in this strange meeting point between modernity and ancient belief that one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of fairy lore unfolded. The year was 1895. The place was a small rural district called Ballyvadlea in County Tipperary, a quiet farming community where neighbors knew one another, and the hills still carried whispers of old stories. Among the people living there was a woman named Bridget Cleary. She was 26 years old, young by the standards of the time, and by all accounts she stood apart from many of the other women in the area. Bridget was confident, independent, and unusually self-assured. She worked as a dressmaker, which meant she earned her own money and interacted with people beyond the narrow boundaries of her village. She was also widely described as strikingly beautiful, with bright eyes and a presence that attracted attention wherever she went. In many ways, she represented a glimpse of the new century beginning to emerge, but the world around her still belonged partly to the old one. In early March of that year, Bridget fell ill. At first, the sickness seemed minor, perhaps a cold or fever that would pass after a few days of rest. But as the illness lingered,
something darker began to take hold of her husband, Michael Cleary. Michael was a cooper by trade, a barrel maker, and by all accounts he loved his wife deeply. Yet he also lived in a cultural landscape where fairy folklore was not merely entertainment, it was part of reality. As Bridget's illness worsened, neighbors and relatives began visiting the house, offering advice and remedies drawn from both Christian prayer and older folk traditions. Among those consulted was a man sometimes described as a fairy doctor, a local figure believed to understand the ways of the other world. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, a terrible idea began to take shape in Michael Cleary's mind. The woman lying in the bed was not truly his wife. The fairies, he believed, had taken the real Bridget Cleary away. The figure in the house was only a changeling left behind in her place. Once this belief took hold, events moved quickly and tragically. Over the course of several days, Michael and several others subjected Bridget to a series of increasingly desperate rituals intended to force the supposed changeling to reveal itself. She was forced to drink bitter herbal mixtures. She was repeatedly questioned in a ritual that blended religious invocation with folk superstition. "Are you Bridget Cleary, wife of Michael Cleary, in the name of God?" Each time she answered that she was. But the answer did not satisfy those who believed the fairies had taken her. The atmosphere in the small cottage grew tense and fevered, a strange mixture of fear, frustration, and conviction. Finally, on the night of March 15th, the tragedy reached its horrifying conclusion. Michael Cleary seized his wife and held her over the kitchen hearth fire, convinced that the flames would drive the fairy impostor away and restore the real Bridget to him. Instead, the fire consumed her. Bridget Cleary died in agony on the floor of her own home. The following morning, Michael carried her burned body outside and buried it in a shallow grave not far from the house. Yet even then, he believed the story had not ended. According to later testimony, Michael traveled to a nearby fairy fort at Kyla Negrana and waited there for 3 nights. He believed that if he waited long enough, the real Bridget would ride out from the fairy mound on a white horse, freed at last from the enchantment of the fair folk. But no horse appeared, no rider came. Eventually, the authorities discovered the crime, and the case exploded across Ireland and Britain as a national sensation. Newspapers described it as the last witch burning in Ireland, though technically Bridget Cleary had been killed under the belief that she was a changeling rather than a witch. Michael Cleary was arrested, tried, and convicted of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The story shocked a society that believed it had already left such beliefs behind. Yet the case revealed how deeply fairy folklore still lived in the cultural imagination of rural Ireland. In the years that followed, the tragedy gave birth to a grim and bitter saying repeated in Irish conversation: "Are you a witch, or are you a fairy, or are you the wife of Michael Cleary?" It was a dark joke, but also a warning about the power of belief when it escapes the balance of reason. This story marks perhaps the darkest corner of the fairy tradition. It is the place where myth stops being a harmless story told beside the fire and becomes something far more dangerous. It is where folklore and fear combine to create tragedy. And yet, dear listener, as heavy as this moment may feel, the story of the fair folk does not end in darkness. Because the fairy tradition is not only a tale of fear or superstition, it is also a story of curiosity, of individuals who dared to look at the fairy world not as a threat, but as a mystery waiting to be understood. And among those seekers, there was one man whose story stands apart from all others, a quiet Scottish minister who once walked alone into the hills one evening and never came back.
In the year 1691, long before modern anthropology, long before historians began systematically collecting the mythology stories of rural cultures, a quiet Presbyterian minister in the Scottish Highlands sat at a wooden desk, and began writing a manuscript that no publisher of his era dared to print. The book did not describe theology or sermons. It did not attempt to defend the authority of the church. Instead, it explored a subject that many educated Europeans considered dangerous, irrational, or simply absurd. Robert Kirk wrote about the fairy world. Yet what makes his work so extraordinary in the history of dark folklore and fairy folklore is not that he wrote about fairies at all. Many people in the Highlands spoke of them freely, in stories passed down through generations. What makes Kirk remarkable is the way he wrote about them. He did not treat the fair folk as imaginary creatures or symbolic metaphors. He treated them as a real society. Robert Kirk served as the minister of Aberfoyle, a small parish located within the wild green landscapes of the Trossachs in Scotland. The region was rich in Gaelic tradition, a place where ancient Celtic mythology and local belief still shaped the worldview of farmers, shepherds, herbalists, and storytellers. Unlike many scholars of his time, Kirk possessed a rare advantage. He spoke Gaelic fluently. This allowed him to communicate directly with the people of the Highlands in their own language, hearing stories not as translations filtered through English, but as living traditions spoken in the rhythms of the original culture. Over time, Kirk began collecting what he heard. He listened carefully to accounts from elderly villagers who described encounters with the fair folk. He recorded the beliefs of herbal healers who claimed to know the places where the veil between worlds grew thin. He wrote down testimonies about strange lights on hillsides, unexplained music carried through the night air, and travelers who believed they had glimpsed figures moving silently across the fields at dusk. What is striking about Kirk's approach is the tone of his writing. He does not mock the speakers. He does not dismiss their stories as superstition. Instead, he writes with the curiosity of a naturalist studying an unfamiliar ecosystem. In 1691, he compiled these observations into a manuscript titled The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies. The document remains one of the most unusual texts in the entire archive of European folklore. In its pages, Kirk describes the fairy world not as a distant magical realm, but as a parallel civilization existing alongside humanity. According to the testimonies he gathered, the fair folk inhabited the same physical landscape as humans, but moved within a slightly different state of reality. Using modern language, we might describe it as existing on a different frequency of perception. The fair folk were believed to occupy hills, valleys, forests, and rivers that humans also inhabited. Yet they remained invisible most of the time because their world operated just beyond the ordinary range of human senses. Kirk wrote that these beings lived in communities. They ate, they drank, they formed families, they married and mourned their dead. They possessed territories, hierarchies, and systems of law. Some among them were curious about humans, others avoided contact entirely. In Kirk's description, the fairy world begins to resemble something less like fantasy and more like a hidden society coexisting quietly beside our own. This perspective makes his manuscript remarkably modern in tone. Instead of presenting fairies as mystical creatures of legend, he treats them almost as an undiscovered branch of natural history. He observes their patterns, their customs, their possible motives. The fairy world becomes something that might be studied rather than feared. For the Highland people who shared their knowledge with him, this perspective was not unusual. For them, the fair folk had always been neighbors, unpredictable but real, inhabiting the same hills and valleys their families had farmed for centuries. But for the educated society of the 17th century Europe, the idea that a Christian minister would document such beliefs as credible testimony was deeply unsettling. It suggested that the boundary between folklore and reality might be far thinner than anyone was comfortable admitting. So for a time,
Robert Kirk's strange manuscript remained exactly what it had begun as, a quiet collection of observations written by a thoughtful minister who had taken the beliefs of the Highland people seriously. The pages of the secret Commonwealth of elves, fauns, and fairies circulated privately among a small circle of readers, but it was never formally published during Kirk's lifetime. Perhaps the subject was simply too unusual for the intellectual climate of the 17th century. Or perhaps there were deeper reasons why the manuscript remained hidden for so long. Because in the year following its completion, something happened that transformed Robert Kirk from a careful observer of fairy folklore into one of its most haunting legends. The evening of May 14th, 1692, began like many other evenings in the quiet parish of Aberfoyle. The long Highland twilight stretched across the hills, turning the forests dark and the sky pale with lingering light. Robert Kirk, as was his habit, left his house for a walk. The path he chose led upward toward a grassy rise that overlooked the village and the surrounding valley. The hill was known locally as Doon Hill. To the people of the region, it was not an ordinary hill. It was widely regarded as a fairy hill, one of those ancient places where the boundary between the human world and the other world seemed particularly thin. Kirk had visited the hill many times before. For a man who had spent years listening to the stories of fairy encounters, the place must have held a special fascination. Perhaps he walked there that evening simply to think, to reflect on the strange ideas he had been recording in his manuscript. Perhaps he walked there because the quiet of the hillside offered a peaceful place for contemplation. But whatever his reason, Robert Kirk never returned home that night. The next morning, villagers discovered him lying on the slope of the hill. He appeared to have collapsed suddenly, his body motionless among the grass. The official explanation was simple. Robert Kirk had suffered a stroke or sudden illness and died where he fell. His body was carried back to the village and buried according to the customs of the church he had served. Yet the people of Aberfoyle were not entirely convinced by this ordinary explanation. In the cultural landscape shaped by centuries of fairy folklore and dark folklore, another interpretation seemed far more plausible. Robert Kirk, they believed, was not truly dead. He had been taken. According to the local tradition that developed soon after his death, the fair folk had grown displeased with the minister who had documented their hidden society so carefully. By describing their world in such detail, by recording their customs and territories, Kirk had revealed secrets that were never meant to be written down. The fairies, it was said, had drawn him into the hill itself. His body remained in the mortal world, but his spirit now lived within the hidden halls beneath Doon Hill, among the very beings he had spent years studying. This belief might have remained a quiet local legend if not for one more strange story that soon followed. According to later accounts, Robert Kirk appeared to a relative in a dream or vision shortly after his burial. In this appearance, he explained that he was not truly dead, but held captive in the fairy realm beneath the hill. He gave detailed instructions for how he might be rescued. When his child was to be baptized, Kirk said, he would briefly appear at the ceremony. If a particular action were taken at the right moment, the enchantment binding him could be broken and he would return to the human world. The story says that the opportunity did indeed come. During the baptism ceremony, a figure resembling Robert Kirk appeared among the gathered family members exactly as he had promised. Yet the relative who had been instructed to act hesitated. Whether from fear, disbelief, or confusion, the instructions were not carried out correctly. The moment passed, the figure vanished, and Robert Kirk was never seen again. Over time, the story became part of the living folklore of the region. Visitors traveling through the Scottish Highlands eventually learned of the strange fate of the minister who had tried to map the invisible world of the fair folk. On the summit of Doon Hill today stands a tall Scots pine tree that has become known as the minister's pine.
The tree is often covered with ribbons, coins, and small written prayers left by visitors who climbed the hill. Some come simply out of curiosity. Others come because they feel a quiet connection to the old stories of the land. The wind moves gently through the branches of the pine, carrying the soft rustling sound of needles against bark. And if you stand there in the fading light of evening, looking down at the village of Aberfoyle and the green valley stretching beyond it, the place possesses a stillness that feels almost timeless. The people of Aberfoyle will sometimes tell visitors a final detail of the story. They say that if you place your ear against the bark of the minister's pine on a quiet night, you might hear something beneath the sound of the wind, a faint murmur, a distant voice, perhaps only the imagination responding to the power of an old legend, or perhaps, as the oldest stories of fairy folklore gently suggest, the quiet voice of the minister who once tried to describe the invisible world and never quite managed to leave it again.
And then, something quiet and almost invisible happened to the old gods. It did not arrive with armies or iron swords or burning temples. No empire marched across the hills of Ireland to defeat them. Instead, something softer, gentler, and far more powerful slowly reshaped them. They were transformed not by conquest, but by imagination, by art, by the subtle hand of storytelling itself. And in that transformation, the ancient beings of Celtic mythology stories began to shrink. For thousands of years, the Aos Sí had been remembered as something magnificent and dangerous. In the oldest Irish and fairy folk traditions, they were tall, radiant, and unsettlingly beautiful. They lived beneath the green hills and ancient mounds, moving between the mortal world and the other world with effortless grace. These were not decorative spirits or playful creatures. They were remnants of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the old Gaelic gods who had once ruled Ireland before withdrawing beneath the land. To encounter them in those early stories was never a small matter. A traveler might be led astray on a moonlit road. A musician might vanish for what seemed like a single night and return to discover that years had passed. A child might disappear from a cradle while the wind whispered softly through the hills. The fair folk were powerful, unpredictable, and profoundly alien to human ways of thinking. But by the early 19th century, something remarkable had begun to change. As the world entered the Victorian era, the old countryside beliefs that had shaped Irish folklore for centuries began to fade. Industrialization spread across Britain and Ireland. Railways cut through the countryside. Cities grew larger. People who once lived close to the rhythms of the land moved into crowded urban streets. And with that shift, the living relationship between humans and the hidden world slowly weakened. The fairy forts still stood in the fields. The ancient stone circles still rested in the grass. But fewer and fewer people remembered why they had once been treated with such careful respect. Into that cultural space stepped artists and writers who began to reinterpret the fairy world through a new lens. One of the earliest influences had appeared centuries earlier in the works of William Shakespeare. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, the fairy king, Oberon, and the mischievous Puck were charming, playful figures who moved lightly through enchanted forests. Shakespeare's fairies were already smaller and gentler than the formidable beings of earlier Celtic traditions. Yet even Shakespeare's vision still contained something mysterious and powerful. The Victorians, however, refined the transformation further. During the 19th century, illustrators such as Richard Dadd and Arthur Rackham produced images that would forever reshape how the Western world imagined fairies. Their paintings and drawings were intricate, delicate, and enchanting. But they were also profoundly different from the old mythology stories that had once filled the hills and valleys of Ireland. The tall, radiant Aos Sí were replaced by tiny winged creatures perched upon flowers and mushrooms.
Instead of commanding ancient courts beneath the earth, they fluttered lightly through gardens and woodland clearings. Their expressions were mischievous rather than dangerous. Their presence felt decorative rather than supernatural. In children's books, they received whimsical names like cobweb, mustard seed, and peas blossom. They danced among petals and dewdrops, laughing softly beneath moonlit leaves. The transformation was so complete that many readers no longer recognized the connection between these delicate Victorian fairies and the powerful beings described in older Irish folklore traditions. What had once been feared as a presence capable of altering fate became a charming character suitable for nursery illustrations. Yet this transformation was not merely an artistic evolution. It represented something deeper within cultural memory. The old beliefs that once governed daily life were being quietly replaced. In earlier centuries, a farmer might carefully plow around a fairy mound, leaving it untouched out of respect for the unseen inhabitants beneath. A household might leave milk or butter at a stone on May Eve, acknowledging the presence of neighbors who existed just beyond the visible world. But in the modernizing society of the 19th century, those customs began to feel unnecessary. Scientific thinking reshaped how people understood the world. The mysterious forces that had once explained strange events were slowly replaced by rational explanations. And so the fair folk lost their place in the practical lives of ordinary people. As bedtime history passed from generation to generation, the stories themselves softened. The terrifying beings of ancient mythology stories gradually became harmless characters in bedtime tales. By the late Victorian period, the transformation was complete. The mighty Tuatha Dé Danann had been reduced to tiny sprites that could fit comfortably inside a decorative illustration. The gods of the hollow hills had been domesticated by imagination. They had been made safe, charming, and small. It was perhaps one of the most subtle cultural transformations in Western history. No temple had been destroyed, no sacred texts had been burned. Instead, the old gods had simply been redrawn, and in the quiet space between brushstrokes and storytelling, they slowly faded into something far gentler than they had ever been before.
And yet, even after the fairies had been softened by Victorian art and imagination, the old fascination with them never completely disappeared. The hills still held their quiet stories, and somewhere deep in the collective memory of Europe, the sense remained that the fairy world might not be entirely gone. It might simply be waiting in places where the modern world had forgotten to look. In the summer of 1917, in a small garden in the village of Cottingley in Yorkshire, two young girls produced a moment that would briefly awaken that old curiosity once again. Their names were Elsie Wright and Frances Griffiths. Elsie was 16, Frances only 10, cousins spending their days exploring the small stream and wooded corners behind their family home. Like many children of their time, they had grown up surrounded by the Victorian imagery of fairies. Tiny winged beings dancing among flowers and mushrooms, exactly the sort of creatures that had replaced the ancient fair folk of Irish folklore and Celtic mythology stories. One afternoon, the girls borrowed a camera and disappeared into the garden. When they returned, they claimed to have captured something extraordinary. The photograph they developed showed young Frances sitting calmly on the grass, while several delicate winged fairies appeared to dance before her. The creatures were exactly as Victorian artists had imagined them: small, elegant, and surrounded by an almost theatrical sense of enchantment. At first, the adults around them dismissed the image as childish play, but the photograph slowly found its way beyond the small household where it had been taken. Eventually, the pictures came to the attention of a man whose name carried enormous influence in the early 20th century, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Conan Doyle was famous for writing stories about logic, deduction, and rational investigation. Yet in his personal life, He held a deep fascination with spiritualism and the possibility of unseen worlds existing alongside our own. When he saw the Cottingley photographs, he believed they might represent genuine evidence of the fairy realm. Conan Doyle studied the images carefully and consulted photographic experts of the time. None of them could find obvious signs of manipulation according to the techniques available in early photography. Encouraged by this, Doyle published the photographs in the Strand magazine, presenting them as possible proof that fairies were real. The public response was immediate and intense. Across Britain and beyond, people debated the photographs passionately. Some believed the images confirmed the survival of the fairy world described in ancient mythology stories and bedtime history traditions. Others dismissed them as clever tricks. Newspapers printed articles. Scholars argued. Ordinary readers examined the pictures and wondered whether the small winged figures might truly exist. For decades, the mystery remained unresolved. The photographs became one of the most famous controversies in the long history of fairy folklore. Then, in 1983, more than 60 years after the images had first appeared, Elsie and Francis finally revealed the truth. 4 of the 5 photographs had indeed been staged. The fairies were simple cardboard cutouts copied from illustrations in a children's book and held upright with hat pins. The girls had created the images partly as a playful joke, and partly because they were tired of adults dismissing their stories about the fairy stream behind the house. Yet even within this confession, one final detail lingered with quiet ambiguity. Frances insisted that although 4 photographs were fake, the 5th image she had taken alone might have captured something real. She maintained this belief for the rest of her life. Whether this was simply the persistence of childhood imagination or something more mysterious is impossible to know. And perhaps that uncertainty is exactly what makes the Cottingley photographs such a fitting ending to the long history of the fair folk. Because the story reveals something profound about how humanity has treated the old gods of Celtic tradition. We did not destroy them, we did not conquer them with iron, or erase them with fire. Instead, we turned them into images small enough to hold inside a photograph. We transformed them into paper figures pinned delicately into a garden scene. And then we spent decades arguing about whether they had ever been real at all. Yet even now, beyond photographs and illustrations, the physical landscape of Ireland still holds the memory of those older stories. The fairy mounds remain scattered across green fields and quiet hillsides. The circular earthworks known as fairy forts still appear in the countryside, ancient and undisturbed. Farmers still guide their plows carefully around them, not always because they consciously believe in the fair folk, but because the tradition of respect has never entirely vanished. Somewhere beneath those grassy hills lies the echo of a much older world. A world remembered in mythology stories, bedtime history, and the quiet whispers of fairy folklore passed from one generation to the next. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our journey. From the Neolithic stone tombs, through the golden age of the gods, through the great retreat and the hidden courts, through changeling cradles and burning kitchens, through a minister's lonely walk upon a fairy hill, and finally to a girl's photograph in a quiet Yorkshire garden. The fairies were never quite what we were told they were. They were older than the stories, deeper than the drawings, more dangerous, more beautiful, and perhaps more real than modern imagination is comfortable admitting. Let the fire fade gently now. Let the shadows gather at the edges of the room. Imagine the green hills of Ireland settling quietly into your thoughts like a soft blanket of moss. Beneath those hills, the old gods remain patient. They have waited for 3,000 years. They can wait a little longer. Good night, dear listener. Sleep well. And if tonight you dream of a small door hidden in the side of a grassy hill, perhaps it is wiser not to open it. Or perhaps it is exactly what you should do. Sweet dreams.